let's do a little bit deep dive on Scrum plus Kanban, ScrumBan. You've done some. You actually written a book about it.
Yeah. So this
in
was
simple words, like how would you like teach a new team? Like if they a lot of the times people start with Scrum and they're like, oh look, there's all these tickets coming in and there's no option not to do it, so it's hard to keep up the sprint plan. I've came up with that situation. So how do you coach a new team to do ScrumBan?
Okay. So first of all, anytime you're coaching, there's an old saying about teaching, which is teach people where they are, not where you want them to be.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step is understanding exactly where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, people come to ScrumBan from a Scrum perspective.
Yeah.
And often what you were just talking about, a not particularly well implemented Scrum in the sense that it might be working for them, but it's not particularly agile.
Right.
So I like to go back to what it means for something to be agile to start with. And honestly, I feel like the Manifesto for Agile Development is really a great starting point.
Right.
What does it mean? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right? Working software over comprehensive documentation. Responding to change over following a plan. What I like to remind people first is when you say this over that, it doesn't mean that we don't believe in planning or comprehensive documentation.
Yeah.
It means that we value responding to change over following a plan. So our plan is great, but if we need to change, then we make that change and we figure out a way to build our product so that it can be changed and do our planning so that it's easy to change. And in the same way, like we value comprehensive documentation, but we value working software more.
Yeah.
And there's no better way, and this is a basic idea of Scrum, Scrum for software teams, there's no better way to give your teams a good understanding of what it is, the state of the software and the state of the project, than by putting real working software into their hands and letting them actually work with it. Like
Right.
you have to do that. That's the most important measure of progress.
Yeah.
Now, I like that as a starting point for teaching people about ScrumBan, because that first thing they'll say is, well, what about my Scrum implementation? Is your Scrum implementation, is it, are you really iterative first of all? Like,
yeah.
are you really, are really able to make changes? If halfway through your sprint, you realize, wait, someone comes to you and says, we got this other requirement, we really need to make this change. And it's a big change. And it's gonna make a lot of work for the team. Is your first instinct to resist that change and say, well, this is gonna be a lot of work. Let's figure out how we can not make that change. Or is your first instinct to say, well, of course, if that's what we really need and we know that's what we really need, then we'll make that change.
Right.
Like accepting and understanding change. And that's one of these basic ideas of Agile, and that's really drives Scrum.
Yeah.
So then where I go from there is help them understand, okay, so what is Scrum? What is Kanban? Scrum, the framework for delivering products. It's iterative, it's incremental. We break things down into iterations called sprints. We have these daily meetings where we inspect the plan. We start each sprint with planning. We end it with a demo where we review, where we demonstrate our working software. And if we didn't build anything, we look our team in the eye and our users and stakeholders in the eye and say, we didn't get it done.
Yeah.
And then afterwards we have a retrospective, right, where we actually look back and learn lessons immediately and apply them immediately. That's pretty familiar to most of us.
Right.
Kanban is a little more new for a lot of us, and it's extremely effective. But what Kanban is a process improvement method, and that's the first thing that people kind of have trouble with is, what does that mean? What does it mean for something to be a process improvement method? What it means is is not changing the way you manage your products, because Scrum is about product management and product development, delivery, and sustaining those products.
Right.
Process improvement is about looking at the way you do things today and figuring out exactly what you're doing now and trying to change it so you can do things better in the future. So, in a Kanban, so first of all, it's formulated by a guy named David Anderson, who actually helped Jenny and me with doing some really amazing review for us for our book, Learning Agile, on our Kanban chapter. It's a great guy, really innovative work. And what he does, the idea here is you basically have some very basic important elements. You start with what the team does now, meaning you look at what you're actually doing and try to really understand. Second one is understand the process, using things like a value stream map, where you take an actual piece of work that was actually done and you map it. Okay, so it was in planning for this many days, and then it waited, and then it was doing a requirements analysis, and it waited, and then it went to design, and it waited, and then the developers worked on it for these, for this many days, and then the testers tested it for this long, and then it waited for another review. And you look at exactly the actual steps that it goes through. And that'll make a process. And in Kanban, the processes are linear. So you'll see them, if you've seen a Kanban board, it kind of looks like a familiar task board that a lot of Scrum teams use. So we'll have a board both has 3 columns: to do, in progress, and done. A Kanban board will have usually a lot of processes, a lot of columns rather, that correspond to the actual steps that each piece of work goes through. And so they're going to be different for different organizations or different teams.
Yeah.
And what you'll do then is you do experimenting. You set a WIP limit, a work in progress limit, by saying only 6 work items can be in this one stage. And if there's a 7th one that's going to go in that stage, we won't do it, and we're going to work elsewhere in other parts of the project.
Can we do a little double click? Can we talk a little bit more about setting up the WIP limit? I think that's where a lot of people struggle. Like, why WIP limit? How to set it up? Things like that. Yes,
that is. You're right. Well, that's very much the most difficult. There's a lot of difficulty there. So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about flow, just a little bit. And this is the theory behind it. It comes from something called queuing theory. I'm not going to go into much of the math about it, except for one thing. There's something called Little's law.
Yeah.
And Little's law says that there's a simple ratio, it's proportional, that relates to the arrival rate, the rate at which work items are added to the system, and the total capacity of the system, the number of total work items total in the system. And what we find is that the lead time, when you talk about when the time between when somebody makes a request and when it actually get their hands on what you've delivered to them, that is entirely dependent on that flow. And what sort of a queuing theory says is, you could, if you've got a set of stages in the process, if one of those stages, if one of those stages is essentially causing a bottleneck, although we don't really talk about bottlenecks in Kanban, if you limit the flow there, then you can actually speed up your entire process by limiting the place where things are getting clogged up in the system. Right. And that sounds really theoretical, and that's where a lot of people kind of go off the rails. They're not really sure what to make of it. So what Jenny and I did in Learning Agile is we actually drew a parallel to a doctor's office, where we let's say you had to visit a particular doctor, right? And you had to you find out that, and you actually have to go back a few times, and so you have several experiences in their waiting room, and each time it doesn't seem like there are that many people in the waiting room, but you're waiting forever, and it takes forever to. And we've all had that experience waiting in a doctor's waiting room. So what you would do is how would you use flow, these ideas of flow and WIP limits to kind of improve that doctor's office? Well, you could come up with a simple process. Right. You've got, let's say my doctor, you'll sit there in the waiting room, and then they'll bring you into an exam room, and usually you'll sit there for another few minutes before the doctor actually sees you. Right. So let's say they have 5 exam rooms and 2 doctors. So you can have a whole bunch of people seated in the waiting room. You've got a natural WIP limit of 5 on the exam rooms because you can only have 5 people in exam rooms, because once you've got 5 people in those exam rooms, you're never going to put 2 patients in the same exam room. Right. People are going to be waiting. So every time you, if you've filled up all the exam rooms, then people are going to just have to wait and sit in the waiting room. Also, there's only 2 doctors. So there's another natural WIP limit on that column for seeing the doctor, because there can only be 2 people in this at any time seeing up, either 0, 1, or 2 people are seeing doctors.
Right.
So if you were going to draw this on a board, you'd have like a sticky note or a post-it or a next card or something. One person for each patient in the waiting room, and then you would move them from the waiting room to the exam room. Every time someone moved to the exam room, and then every time the doctor walked in, you'd move them from the waiting in the exam room column to seeing the doctor column.
Right.
So what you could find is, since you have this, what you could do is let's say you wanted to adopt a WIP, put in a new work in progress limit. Well, you already have limits on the exam rooms and seeing the doctor, so there's only one other place you can put a limit, and that's the number of people seated in the waiting room. So let's say the office staff said, you know what, we are not going to seat more than 6 people. Usually there's like 10 or 15 people in this waiting room. We're never going to allow more than 6 people in the waiting room. And what we'll do is, if we hit 4 or 5 people, we'll actually pick up the phone and call the people waiting, and who are going to be waiting, and tell them, hey, our waiting room is getting kind of full. We see that you're just here for a regular checkup, and it's not urgent. Can we reschedule you? And when you get here, you'll be the first. We'll immediately bring you back to an exam room. You won't have to wait at all in the waiting room. Yeah. So you that most people will say yes, of course. Yeah. And so they'll be able to put that. Then putting that WIP limit in the waiting room, what they've done is they've reduced the total arrival rate. Right. Because they by putting the WIP limit in place, that forced them to reduce the number of people who walk into the door of the office. And by doing that, they reduced the total amount of pressure on the flow, and the average wait time that everybody has will actually go down significantly. Right. Yeah. I saw this actually work in real life. So when we are in Minneapolis, when my wife and I are in Minneapolis, we live on a high floor in a large apartment building. Nice. And for some reason, when they build this building, they put the swimming pool on the roof. Yes. And that's a terrible place to put a swimming pool. The reason you don't do that is because one day, 2 or 3 years ago, this pool sprang a leaked all over a bunch of apartments, luckily not ours, and also took several of the elevators out of commission. So we went down from 4 elevators to 2 elevators. And then at one point, it went down to even 1 elevator. When it went from 4 to 2, that slowed things down. We had to wait an extra 2 or 3 minutes for each elevator. But as soon as it went down from 2 elevators to 1 elevator, so that set that WIP limit down from 2 to 1, the wait times went up from like 2 minutes to 10 minutes. It was unreal, sometimes even 15 or 20 minutes. It was unreal how much just a single extra elevator makes a huge difference. Yeah. And that's without going into the actual math and theory behind it, that's a good example of why queuing theory and setting WIP limits actually works. By setting a WIP limit in the waiting room in the doctor's office, you can relieve pressure on the entire process, and the total time that it takes from when you show up to when you leave goes down on average for everybody. Yeah. And now here's the thing, and this is also why Kanban is hard. The office staff actually had to do some work. They have to actually call people up and say, well, we have to basically offer you something of value to agree not to come in because we're overburdened right now. Yeah. And that's a term for it, when you've got a system that's overburdened. Right. Well, what does that look like on a software team, for example? Well, let's say you've got 4 or 5 or 10 steps to your process, and one of those is, senior managers are waiting to review something. Right. Well, let's say that's where things clog up. So you see like 15 or 20 different Post-its or index cards have clogged up in that one senior manager review process. Well, now you have to actually go, if you want to put a WIP limit there, you want to say, okay, let's limit the works in progress, not allow more than, say, 8 work items in this column. you actually have to go to that senior manager and say, you know what, you need to start reviewing these things more frequently, and we're not going to put anything more on any other work items on your desk until you get through your backlog. So that's a really hard conversation to have with some senior managers. They're going to be mad. They're like, no, fix it somewhere else. I'm the boss. You're not the boss. You don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do.
Yes.
You know, that's, you know, the bosses that we've both had in the past. Like, I'm very fortunate that the managers that I'm working with right now are amazing. And that's one reason that the team that I've been working with lately has, you know, for the last few years has just been incredible, and why I keep working with them. But I've, you know, in the past, I've worked with managers who would never put up with that kind of thing.
Right.
You know, now when it works well, what happens is when you can actually have a dialogue with your managers and with the people who are making decisions, and you actually can put these limits in place, then what you actually see is, this is especially important when you have multiple people, multiple managers feeding work into the same team, like teams that are doing work for multiple different stakeholders. They'll start doing horse trading. They'll say, we know we only have 6 slots here in this one process column. And one manager will actually go to another and say, look, this one really needs to get done. What can we do? Maybe if I do this now, I'll let you have the next 2 slots. They start horse trading amongst themselves.
Right.
What you've done is then you've taken the burden and taken it out of the system and pushed it back onto the people who are actually causing the burden, which is the managers putting too much work into the system in the first place.
Right.
That's what Kanban does. That's how it works. And then there's a lot of details to it, like what signal cards Kanbans actually are, how setting up pull systems, and that's what a ScrumBan is all about. It's just going into the details of how that works. And we talk a lot about that in Learning Agile as well, exactly how you set up a pull system and what that looks like.
Right.
But before you can even get there, just the basics of what exactly it is to set up WIP limits to improve your process. You know, and the other piece of it is experimentation. You set a WIP limit. We think setting a WIP limit here of 6 will work. Well, that did okay. Maybe 5 is better. Maybe 7 is better. So what you'll do is you'll actually measure the flow through your system, and there's measurements you can take. You can create these cumulative flow diagrams. But really, what you can do is just measure your average lead time. The lead time between when someone requests things and when they deliver it. If the average lead time goes up, then you moved your WIP limit in the wrong direction. If the average lead time goes down, you moved it in the right direction.
Right.
And it gives you a really simple way to set up these experiments. Set a WIP limit, measure the lead time. And over the next couple of weeks or months or however long it takes you to decide whether your experiment worked. And then you adjust based on that real information. And that should be very familiar to Scrum teams, because Scrum is all about experimenting. Scrum is all about actually that's what iterative software is about. It's about setting up at the beginning of the sprint, here's what we think is going to happen, and then over the course of the sprint, making adjustments based on real facts. When you read about Scrum, what you'll talk about is, in Scrum theory, is empirical process control.
Right.
Empiricism, meaning knowledge that comes from experience and making actual decisions, not just guesses, but actually looking at facts and making changes. And if you've got a Scrum team that's based on actual empirical process control, that's actually doing real inspections and making real adaptations based on the facts they've made visible, based on real transparency, then Kanban will make a lot of sense to them. But if you've got something that's calling themselves Scrum or Agile and has adopted a lot of the language, but they're really still just a command and control team, these things are going to sound very foreign to them, because what they're really doing is planning up front, probably because of that CYA environment we talked about earlier. And this probably won't work that well for them, because they've got a culture that might be less based on trust and more based on blame. And in that case, a command and control CYA system really makes the most sense for everybody, because you need that documentation to prove that it's not your fault. Because most important is you want to keep your job for the next year. You don't want to be fired because something went wrong, even if it's not your fault. So that's sort of Scrum in a nutshell there.
Yeah, so you're saying that with Scrum, it's a product delivery framework. You can inspect and adapt, plan, it's an iterative and incremental approach. And then when you combine with more of a flow-based approach like Kanban, you have opportunity to really create that flow and really experiment on how do you improve the process of delivering value.
Right.
And then you also initially you also talked about one of the hardest problems is what to build. Have you seen anything around in ScrumBan where there is a validated column in terms of inspecting and adapting on like, okay, we said if we build this feature, this will happen. Has that happened? Because a lot of the times it's a hypothesis when teams are building something for the first time, right? So
right. Well, so that's what if you have a team that does that kind of a validation at the end of the process, then you'll show that on your Kanban board. You'll define it, and then you'll build it, and you'll validate it. That in a sprint review, in a Scrum team, your sprint review is your validation. And what you learn from that validation is you didn't build it right, because we never got it exactly right. The whole point is to iterate.
Right.
And I feel like a really good Scrum team, the people on it and the people working with them, understand that that the goal is not to build the perfect piece of software, is to build something based on what we understand, and then learn from it by talking to the people who need the software, and then build something, improve it based on what we learned.
Right.
And one important role of the Scrum Master is to help everybody, not just in the team, but the people working with the team, understand that that's how you work with these people. That's how you work with our team, is we will all work together to try to understand. We as a team will understand that you don't know exactly what you want. Yeah. And you as a stakeholder will understand that we can't read your mind. Right. And so we'll work together. And you'll understand that when we build something that's not perfect, it's okay, because we'll get it closer next time. And you won't, and because the minute that a stakeholder sees the wrong thing and freaks out, that's the moment that the team closes ranks and realize they have to protect themselves. Right. That's because what you've done is you've eroded the trust there. Because again, it all comes down to trust. And part of the Scrum Master's role in that servant leadership role is to help establish that trust and grow that trust. Because trust is earned and grown over time. It's not just something you can come out with.
Right.
So that's that. And this works both in pure like Scrum and also in ScrumBan and everything in between. Any team, even a waterfall team, works better when you have, and I've worked on waterfall teams that worked really, really well. And it was because we established this trust between the people who needed the software and those of us building the software.
Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We will sure to come back with more exciting videos on Agile topics.